Noswaith dda I chi. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the last session of the HEC conference for 2020 in its virtual state. It's really the last session, but it's a case of last but certainly not least, as we're very privileged indeed to have a very star performer in Professor Frank Mitloehner of the CLEAR University of California with us this evening. And he is one of the world's leading men and professionals in the subject of carbon neutrality, and is very much in demand as an expert on environmental policy and sustainability throughout the world. So Frank, just to give you some background to Frank's career, is one of the world experts, as I mentioned earlier on, and he's keen to share his thoughts with us this year on this conference rather, on the misunderstood role sometimes of red meat production as we aim to reduce our emissions and achieve net zero. Frank is a professor of air quality and in the Department of Animal Science at the University of California, Davis, and he has very much an interest in research that is directly relevant to understanding and mitigating air emissions on livestock operations, which is a very subject close to our heart in Wales, I should say. He sits on many global committees as a learned advisor, and is therefore very much in demand for his expertise worldwide. Now then, just to give us some context to what we're going to do over the next 45 minutes or so, Frank is going to run through a presentation that he's prepared for us in Wales on sustainability. And once Frank concludes his presentation, we'll have a question and answer session. And as always, please use the questions in the chat function that you see on the right-hand side of your screen. So without further ado, let's get on with the real stuff. And Frank, welcome to Wales, croeso I Gymru, and I'm handing over to you to take us through your thoughts on climate neutrality.
Thank you very much, Gwyn. It's a real pleasure for me to be here with you today. Let me just get my presentation going. I assume that you can see me, that you can see my slides. Is that correct?
Yes, I can see your slides. They're not full screen, but I can see your slides. Oh, they are. That's good. That's good.
Okay. So, well, let me first start out by saying that I feel very humbled and honored to be a speaker here today. Here in California, it's still morning, but I know it's evening now, dinner time, so I will be concise. So I will talk to you about a project that I think is really important. It is one of rethinking methane. But I want to be very clear. I by no means say that methane doesn't matter, that livestock is not a major source of methane or any of that. But what I will do is I will provide you with some nuance that's really important to get the narrative around methane from livestock right. Because the way we quantify methane currently, quantify methane, for example, for stable herds that haven't really increased or decreased over the last few decades, is off by a factor of 4. When methane either increases or decreases, then we are also off by a factor of 4. And that can be really detrimental because we certainly don't want to see increases of methane over time, because that would have a strong impact on warming. But we do want to see decreases of methane over time, because that can really be a great opportunity for people in animal agriculture. But be it as it may, what has to happen is we have to get methane right. And so here is my presentation on this topic. If you feel like it gets too technical or so and you want to revisit it later, you can, because my CLEAR Center has produced a video called Rethinking Methane. It's on YouTube and you can download it anytime and watch it and share it. And I encourage you to do so. So really quickly, what do greenhouse gases do? Those gases that are responsible for what people call global warming or climate change. Well, first of all, the sun radiates down solar radiation to the surface of the Earth. Normally, that would be reflected back into space if there weren't these so-called greenhouse gases. Gases such as CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, and others, which pretty much lay a blanket over the Earth atmosphere, preventing some of that solar radiation and the related heat to go back to space. These greenhouse gases are actually important. Without them, we couldn't live on Earth. It would be too cold. The problem, however, is that we are making this blanket too thick by adding too many of these greenhouse gases. And hence, there's a need to reduce greenhouse gases to not trap too much of that sun heat in our atmosphere. When people talk about greenhouse gases and compare different sectors, let's say transportation versus power production versus livestock and so on, they use a matrix called the global warming potential. It was established back in 1990 when policymakers wanted to know, how can we actually compare these different sectors of society? How can we compare these different gases? And scientists at the time put together the so-called GWP 100. Please know that term will be repeated in this presentation. GWP 100 refers to the relative difference across these gases, for example, CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide, in how they force climate change, how they trap heat from the sun, so to say. So methane is believed to be about 28 times more potent than CO2. So it is a potent greenhouse gas. Nitrous oxide is even more potent, 265 times more potent than CO2. So, but in addition to this relative potency across these gases, there are other differences as well. And I will focus on methane today. The next slide here will show the so-called global methane budget. And methane is really quite different, distinctively different from other greenhouse gases, because it doesn't just have sources associated with it, but also sinks. In other words, methane is not just produced, but methane is also destroyed. And this is really important. On this slide here, you see global emissions on the left side, such as fossil fuel production and use, agriculture and waste, so that includes cattle and so on, biomass burning, wetlands. You can see wetlands are a strong emitter of methane as well, and so on. So these different sources globally emit a total of, you see it in this half bubble, 560 teragrams of methane. And that's the source function here, 560 teragrams of methane. But if you look on the other side of this budget, you will find that not just are there sources, but also sinks of methane. In other words, there are processes that suck methane out of the air and destroy it. And you can see they amount to 550 teragrams. So 560 teragrams are emitted by sources, and 550 are destroyed or sucked up pretty much in the soils. And that leaves a difference between sources and sinks of 10. That is the total amount of net methane per year, a number we strive to further reduce. But it's important to emphasize that a focus only on emissions is misplaced, because sinks are very important. And here, when you look at the sinks, you find a very strong arrow, a very dominant arrow pointing downward. And that arrow has a text underneath saying sink from chemical reactions. What this sink from chemical reactions means is that methane, let's say you look at Mhrifysgol as a methane molecule, within a very short period of time, meets another molecule in the air called a radical. And this radical steals a portion of that methane, the hydrogen, away from it and destroys the methane. It converts it into CO2 and water. And that happens generally within a decade. And that's described pretty much in this slide here, which shows the half-life of these greenhouse gases. For CO2 and nitrous oxide, the lifespan is very long. They live hundreds to 1,000 years in the environment, in the air. They accumulate over time. Every time we put, let's say, CO2 into the atmosphere, it stays there. It does not really go away in any major way. Some of it is absorbed by oceans and so on, but the majority of CO2 that we, through human activity, put into the air stays there and accumulates. And the same is true for nitrous oxide, but the same is not true for methane. Methane has a lifespan of only 10 years. And that is because it's not just produced, remember emissions, but it's also destroyed. And that's the sinks. And it's really important to get that right. Methane has a short lifespan because it's not just produced, but also destroyed. And that happens within 10 years. That's why methane is referred to as a short-lived climate pollutant, and the other ones as long-lived climate pollutants. So I will now talk about the biological carbon cycle. Some people call it the biogenic carbon cycle. Methane chemically is CH4. You see it depicted on the right here. Ever wondered where the carbon from the CH4 comes from? Well, it comes from the atmosphere, and it starts all with photosynthesis. We learned in school what photosynthesis is, the process by which all plants need sunlight, water, and carbon to then produce carbohydrates and oxygen. The carbon that these plants need, and regardless of which plants we're talking about, that carbon comes from the air, from the atmosphere, in the form of CO2. So CO2 from the atmosphere goes into plants, is then converted into carbohydrates, such as cellulose or starch. And you have a lot of that in Wales, I hear, a lot of grass. And sooner or later, a cow or another ruminant or so comes along and eats those carbohydrates in the form of forages. And then some of that carbon contained in the plants becomes methane, becomes, for example, enteric methane, and also manure-based methane. That methane, though, contains carbon that is not, and this is really important now, not new carbon to the atmosphere, but it is recycled carbon, because this carbon in the methane originated in the atmospheric CO2 before that went into plants that were then eaten. So that methane now stays in the atmosphere for 10 years and is then converted during a process called hydroxyl oxidation. That's caused by these radicals I talked about earlier, converted into CO2 again. That CO2 stays in the atmosphere until the point where, for example, plants suck it out of the atmosphere for photosynthesis again. In other words, what I'm telling you here is that the carbon that becomes methane, a portion of methane, is not new additional carbon added to the atmosphere. If you, and I don't know anything about Wales, I apologize. I have been all over the UK, but never to Wales. Never been invited, I guess.
Well, we can change that.
You can change that. So I didn't just mean to self-invite myself, so I apologize for that. I was rude. So that carbon there is not new and additional carbon. If you, in a place like Wales, have constant cattle herds over years, and you're not going up with herd sizes or down with herd size, but you have constant herds, then the amount of methane produced by your cattle and the amount of methane destroyed through hydroxyl oxidation are roughly in balance. And that means if you have constant cattle herds, constant livestock herds, you're not adding new additional carbon to the atmosphere, and hence you're not adding new additional warming to the atmosphere. And now that's really important, okay? Constant sources of methane do not add to additional methane concentrations. So in the case of the cow carbon cycle, let's call it that, you are not adding additional carbon to the atmosphere unless you are increasing the source strength by growing your herds. This is very different. This biogenic carbon cycle is very different from the fossil carbon that we know of, which is by far the most important, most pressing source of greenhouse gases known to man and caused by man. Fossil carbon is nothing other than plant and animal material that died and decayed and then fossilized hundreds of millions of years ago. We extracted it in the sea and on land. We pulled it out of the ground, we extracted it, and then sooner or later we burned it with cars, trucks, trains, planes, ships, and so on. And then that carbon, that fossil carbon that was in the ground for so long, becomes atmospheric carbon, and that adds to existing CO2 levels in the atmosphere. That, ladies and gentlemen, by far, is the #1 cause of greenhouse gases and climate change caused by man. Here's a contrast of those two processes I just talked about. On the left side, you see the carbon from fossil fuels, again, locked in the ground for a very long time. We unlock it when we extract it, and then we add that carbon to the atmosphere as CO2. This is ancient carbon that is new to the atmosphere. On the cow side, however, we have atmospheric CO2 that makes it during photosynthesis into plants. Some or much of that carbon is then locked in the ground during carbon sequestration. Very important in Wales, as you well know. So a lot of the carbon goes from the atmosphere into the plants and then into the soil where it's sequestered. But some of the other carbon that's in the above vegetative material is eaten by our animals. They then produce some methane. That methane is then converted back into CO2 and added to the carbon stocks of the atmosphere, from which plants then pull new carbon. So this is a cyclical event, and on the left side you see a one-way street. Nobody should compare cows versus cars, because that's an unfair comparison, it's an unscientific comparison. It's one that should have never been made by anyone. I will now show you the very important difference between the stock gas CO2 versus the so-called flow gas methane, and why we should not use GWP 100 for methane. A stock gas, such as CO2, is one that accumulates in the atmosphere. Imagine you were to drive to work on Monday, day one. When you drive to work, you add CO2 to the atmosphere because you burn the gas, you produce CO2 to the atmosphere. On Tuesday, you drive the same distance, and now you add new additional CO2 to the atmosphere, which is now added on top of what you put out the day prior. So now you have the day 2 here, which is twice as high as day 1 was. On day 3, on Wednesday, you drive again, and you add again new additional CO2 to the existing stock, hence the name stock gas. The stock gas accumulates in the atmosphere because it has a long lifespan and it's not really destroyed by any process, okay? Methane is very different. Methane is not a stock gas. Methane is a flow gas. It's produced and it's destroyed, and almost at equal rates, I might add. So if you were to have a dairy with 100 cows and you've had that for 50 years, then only during the first 10 years, you added new additional methane to the atmosphere. After that, because methane has a 10-year lifespan, the amount of methane produced by your cows and the amount of methane destroyed through hydroxy-oxidation were in balance. That is why a constant herd of cattle, for example, will lead to constant concentrations of methane in the atmosphere, meaning a constant herd will not add additional carbon to the atmosphere, hence will not add additional warming to the atmosphere. Why am I showing you this? Because methane currently, using GWP 100, is treated by policymakers as if it were a stock gas, as if it were accumulating in the atmosphere, which it's not. The GWP 100 does not take into consideration that methane is not just produced, but also destroyed. Obviously, an oversight that is very much to the detriment of people in animal agriculture. The first person who brought this to my attention was Professor Miles Allen from Oxford and his team, and they have published extensively about the topic. Some of those more blog type publications are here on the left and in the center. There are well over a dozen now science papers in the high impact journals such as Nature, Science, and so on. In case that you're interested in the nitty-gritty, you'll find a lot of reading material on this. So much of that came from Oxford, but you find it from investigators in New Zealand, here in California, and so on. So this is now no longer some niche discussion. It is one that is international. It is being held at the FAO level in Rome, at the IPCC level, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, and others. This discussion will determine the new narrative, in my opinion, in and around livestock in the years to come. And it's high noon for that. Why? Because what we currently use for public policy is inappropriate, and I will show you why. Imagine 3 different scenarios. One scenario by which you increase methane over a period of 30 years with a given herd of cattle. Let's say your herd of cattle in Wales, let's just say it grew 35% over 30 years. The second scenario is one by which you keep methane pretty stable, or you slightly reduce it by 10% over 30 years. The third scenario is one by which you decrease methane. That does not have to happen by decrease in herd size. It can happen by, let's say, feeding feed additives or doing something with the manure of those animals. So decreasing methane. So the first scenario is increasing methane. The second one is holding methane stable. The third scenario is decreasing methane. What would these three scenarios look like when using the GWP 100 that is customary so far? All three scenarios would show a strong increase in the so-called CO2 equivalent emissions. Even when you decrease methane, it would predict that we are strongly increasing CO2 equivalent emissions, and that means that it treats methane as if it were a stock gas, as if it were always to accumulate and not really be produced and destroyed. That is what Miles Allen from Oxford and others critiqued, and rightfully so. And they came up with an alternative to GWP 100. It's called GWP star. GWP star actually uses CO2 equivalent numbers, so it's not a totally new thing, but it actually predicts the warming of methane, the actual warming of methane, which GWP 100 doesn't do. GWP star predicts the actual warming. So let's see what it predicts. If you increase methane by 35%, it predicts a strong increase in warming equivalence. Again, methane is a potent greenhouse gas. If we increase it over time, it leads to a strong impact on warming. And that's bad. If you hold your methane stable or slightly reduce it, you will see here that the amount of methane that's produced and that's destroyed are in balance, meaning you will not get additional new warming. And that's why you don't see any color north of the x-axis here. But actually, because you have a slight fall of methane of 10% over 30 years here, you see that there's a slight blue area underneath the x-axis. So no additional warming caused by a stable methane source. But look what happens when you decrease methane by 35%. When you decrease methane at a substantive level, then you will not add any positive warming, but you will induce what's called negative warming. So now your warming equivalents here are south of the x-axis, meaning you are inducing cooling. When you decrease methane at any large amount, then you are inducing negative warming, which is cooling. Now, if I make your head spins here, your head spin, then think about governments incentivizing farmers to grow trees on their premises. Why would governments do such a thing? They do that because they know the trees will suck carbon out of the atmosphere, CO2 out of the atmosphere. And they say that's good because that reduces the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. That leads to cooling. What methane reductions do is the same thing. When you reduce methane, you pull carbon out of the atmosphere, which has a cooling effect. Now, this is my last technical slide here, but it's an important one. It shows what happens when you have rising, constant, or decreasing emissions of both CO2 and methane, and the related warming of these emissions. If you have, let's say, a power plant increasing CO2, then that means the related warming will increase exponentially. Why? Because CO2 is a stock gas and it accumulates. When you increase methane, then you also increase the warming associated with that methane, but in a linear way. If you now hold both CO2 and methane stable, for example, by having a power plant producing the same amount of power over 20 years, or a dairy producing the same amount of methane by having the same herd size over 20 years, then what happens to the related warming of that CO2 source and or the methane source? The CO2 source will increase warming because, again, it's a stock gas. What you produce today is on top what you produced yesterday, is on top what you produced the day before, and so on. But methane is different. The amount of methane produced and the amount of methane destroyed are almost in balance. And that means a constant methane source that you see here on top leads to constant warming. And that is what it's all about. It's not about having a certain amount of CO2 that we want to achieve, but it is about reducing warming. That's what the Paris Climate Accord is all about. reducing warming by 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade. That's what it's about. It's about the warming impact. It's about the warming footprint, and not about some whatever carbon footprint. It's about the warming footprint that we should worry about. But now look what happens when you decrease emissions of both CO2 and methane. And that's hugely important. When you decrease CO2, then only at the point where you go to zero, to net zero CO2, only at that point you will plateau the warming. Up until that point of net zero for CO2, you keep rising temperatures. That's why it's so important to reach net zero for CO2. For methane, that's not the case. When you reduce methane, you instantaneously decrease temperature. So if you ask me, and you obviously do, whether or not I think methane is a big deal, I will tell you, yes, it's a big deal. People ask me, is it a super pollutant? And I say, no, it's not a super pollutant. It's a super opportunity. Why? Because when we manage it, when we reduce it, and there are many means to doing this, then we have an instantaneous impact on climate. And that's what we want. So you are holding the key in your hands to induce a cooling effect to the climate by pulling methane out of the atmosphere. And this can be done by numerous means. So remember what I just showed you, what happens when you reduce methane. You see it here, a 35% reduction of methane induces negative warming, means cooling. And this is also emphasized on this slide here to the right. So here on campus at UC Davis, we do a lot of research on reducing methane, finding ways through feed additives, manure management, and so on. We work with the state of California, with the California Air Resources Board and others to quantify methane and to quantify the important mitigation steps that we can take and the effectiveness. And what do we find? We find that the state of California has made some big steps, big changes. Just a few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago it was, a new law was passed called SB 1383, mandating a 40% reduction, that's 40, of methane to be achieved by the year 2030. Our farmers went wild when they heard that. But the state did something smart. They decided not to use the cane approach of rules and regulations and fines to get to that 40% reduction, but to use the carrot approach of financially incentivizing reductions of methane. So the state of California put $500 million into methane mitigation, and our dairy industry and other livestock sectors partnered with the state. And things such as anaerobic digesters were installed, where dairy lagoons were covered. And the biogas that's normally produced is now being captured and then converted into vehicle fuels. It's called RNG, or renewable natural gas. That conversion of biogas into vehicle fuels is highly financially incentivized by the state of California, making it very lucrative to reduce methane. So the first step was really reducing methane from manure. Now the next step is to reducing methane from enteric sources, meaning from belching, through the use of feed additives and so on. So far, we have achieved a 2.2 million metric ton reduction of methane annually, which means that in California, our dairy industry, which produces 20% of all US dairy, so we are a big dairy state here, our dairy industry has reduced its methane by 25%. The goal by 2030 is a 40% reduction, and we are over halfway there. And what a 25% reduction does to climate, I showed to you before. It leads to negative warming or cooling. And that negative warming from methane reductions will counteract the impacts a dairy has on nitrous oxide and CO2. So we are well on a path to climate.
Frank left us for a minute on that.
And with that, I'm pretty much done here. If you want to follow me on Twitter, my handle is GHEGuru. I hope that you will follow me and that we meet there. I also have a blog. That blog is quite interesting, I think. And finally, I'm director of the Peer Center at UC Davis, and here's how you find me. So thank you very much for your attention, and now I'm looking for questions that you might have.
Thanks for that. Really stimulating presentation, excellent food for thought. I'm sure I have lots of questions. on the right-hand chat button. And one of them, which is, if we start on one that I'd jotted down on my paper here, which is repeated in the chat by Nigel Scholar, what is the journey that will make methane to be changed in terms of how it is perceived by other scientists globally and indeed policymakers as a stopgap gas rather, to adopting the GWP star basis on which to evaluate and measure methane. What is that journey in terms of time frame, do you think, Frank?
Well, that's hard to say. First of all, if you ask physicists and chemists, they will tell you that they have known this forever, okay? They have known this forever, that methane is a flow gas, that it's not just produced like other gases, but it's produced and destroyed. So this is not news. What is new is that while, when you look at stable, when you look at methane going, pretty stable, or sorry, when methane goes up, and I might also show you that slide. When methane goes up, then the following thing happens. Whether you use GWP or GWP star doesn't really matter when methane goes up, because both of them predict pretty much the same thing. And you see it on this slide here. Can you see the slide?
No, I can't see it unless
you can't see
that's
it.
the only one.
Okay, then let me do that again. Maybe I get better with some more practice.
Yeah, here we go. Yeah.
So this slide here shows that GWP 100 and GWP star both predict the same as long as methane goes up. You see that, right? They both predict the same. It's a potent greenhouse gas. As long as both of them go up, they predict the same. Where GWP 100 is terrible is when you have a constant source, a stable herd, for example, and it does really do badly when you decrease methane, because it treats methane as if methane were a stock gas. Not just does it get it wrong numerically, but it gets the sign wrong. Instead of plus, we get a minus, a negative warming. A negative warming is a good thing, okay? Negative warming is a good thing because it means you are cooling. So GWP 100 really gets it wrong for stable methane sources, and it really gets it wrong for decreasing methane sources. But that's what we're all about. That's what it is all about. We want to reduce methane, and we want to know what these methane reductions do to climate, right? That's what it's all about. That's what the Paris Climate Accord is all about, to reduce warming. So let's find out how those sectors of society that can actually reduce warming, and that's only agriculture and forestry, how much they can actually help us getting that job done. This is not about deflecting responsibility of animal agriculture. This is certainly not about greenwashing. This is about getting it right for one of the few sectors in society that can actually pull carbon out of the atmosphere.
Absolutely, crucially important that policymakers and we all get it right, because the wrong policy decision would be catastrophic, obviously, for not only food, emissions, and sequestration. Let's go on to a question on sequestration, one in the chat bar on the right there, Frank, and it's from Priest Morgan. If we were to increase the volume of grass grown as well as increasing herd numbers, would one offset the other, i.e. more grass would fix more carbon? What are your views on that comment?
No, it would not. If you increase your herd size, you will increase methane overall. You will increase the carbon footprint of your herd, and I would discourage that. While carbon sequestration is important, we don't know yet how important, how much carbon is sucked out of the atmosphere and stored in the ground. We are not really sure yet. But what I can tell you is sequestration, carbon sequestration can be very, very important as a tool. We have shown in studies here in California that grasslands can sequester more carbon than forestlands under conditions such as ours here, because it depends on what happens to the forest, what happens to the trees after their productive lifespan. If they just burn down like they do in California, then all of that carbon that was stored in the trees is then being released into the atmosphere. That certainly is not what you want. If you, however, take that timber off and you make it into furniture, well, then you have actually put that carbon away for a longer time. But grasslands actually have an instantaneous effect. Not so much above ground, but below ground. The roots, and then from the roots, that carbon goes into the soil. So I think that carbon sequestration is very important, particularly to a country or to a state like yours. That's particularly important because you have so much of it.
Let me push you slightly on that last point then, and you mentioned trees and grassland in the same sentence. Is the answer, and you often hear people, oh, let's plant more trees, and probably not mention too much about grassland, but where is the sweet spot between those two fixes of carbon in effect? Surely the answer is a bit of both somewhere, isn't it, I guess?
Yeah, so you are a great moderator because you're asking and answering the question. So it's exactly that. It's a bit of both, okay? It's a compromise. The grass, grows fast, it sequesters fast. The other one, the trees, need a long time for that, okay? So if you now incentivize, as the Welsh government, the planting of trees on farms, then you tell me, how long will it take for those trees to put away a lot of carbon?
Yeah.
The goal for all of us is to make a dent within the next decade or two, okay? That's the goal. And so for governments now to come up, say, let's all start planting trees, will not get us where we want to go, which is to have an instantaneous effect on sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. Grasslands are much quicker at that, and they don't have to grow for a decade or decades to be at that point.
Thanks for that, Frank. Let's go to another question, and I'm just picking them out randomly from the right-hand screen. There's lots of them, and excellent. Mae Frank is asking there, with an increase in demand for animal protein globally and the need to have constant livestock numbers, how then do we feed the world population?
Well, if I were to have that answer, I'd be a Nobel Prize winner, I promise. First of all, much of the world is doing better today than they did 10 or 20 years ago. The disposable income of much of the poor world is increasing. And one of the first things families do when they have more disposable income is afford some more animal source foods. So the first thing they change is add some eggs and a little bit of milk and a little bit of meat to their diet. Cumulatively, that means that livestock and poultry herds and flocks in the world are increasing, particularly because of the developing world. And that's disconcerting because many of these countries are not really very efficient, not very productive in how they grow these animals. And instead of increasing efficiencies, they're just growing herds. And growing herds means more methane. That's not good. We don't want to see that. In the developed world, the opposite is true. In much of the developed world, we have shrunk our herds and flocks, but we are producing more product with them. Why? Because we have learned to be more efficient in feeding, in reproduction, in veterinary care, and so on. And that's the trend we should take globally. We need to make use of marginal lands globally because 2/3 of all agricultural land in the world is marginal, much like the land you have in Wales. Marginal, meaning you can't just convert that into growing crops there. You will not be able to grow corn there or soy or nuts, but you will be able to grow stuff there which is rich in cellulose, and cellulose can only be digested by ruminant animals. Cellulose is the #1 biomass in the world, which grows on 2/3 of all agricultural land. And the only animals that can digest it and make that into highly digestible animal source foods are ruminant animals.
Yeah. And with that in mind, and I'll go on to another question in a minute, but what you said previously about grassland and trees, just for me to clear in my own head, if we have a timescale of 2050, shall we say, for neutrality, which is only 30 years away, grasslands have a massively important role to play in that because of the speed with which we need to reduce emissions and sequester more carbon. And therefore, as you mentioned, the trees are going to take 30 years to grow a canopy, aren't they? And therefore, grasslands and livestock farming is a massive part of the solution in temperate climates.
They are.
Thank you for that. Now then, we go into a question from Mr. Dunsford, which is, and I'll read it to you, Frank. If we consider the effects of nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide from the agri-industry, what is the genuine impact of agriculture on climate change?
So there's no question that agriculture affects climate. And when you look at the various inventories throughout the world, you will find that in most developed countries, agriculture is roughly responsible for 10%. However, what I find interesting is that most emission inventories, for example, the one here in the United States by the EPA, states that livestock and plant agriculture are responsible for 10%. But then you go a few pages further on, and they will talk about sinks. And they will talk about how much carbon is taken out of the air by plants and soils. And that amount is almost equal the amount of carbon that agriculture puts into the air. If you read IPCC reports or national reports by agencies that deal with this stuff about sources and sinks from different sectors of society, you will find that the only two sectors of society that don't just emit, but also reduce greenhouse gases are agriculture and forestry. And these are the two sectors that oftentimes are just not at the table when there are climate change negotiations of international importance, and they should be. And people in agriculture should endorse discussion around climate because you can be a very important solution. Don't think of it as being a liability. Think of it as a potential asset, particularly if you take it on with respect to having plans to reducing it. And I encourage that. I encourage you to reduce methane. There are many ways of doing that. Do it. Because that changes you from a liability of sorts for climate to an asset.
So yes, embracing the issue in a positive manner is crucially important. But how? And there's a couple of questions. One from Mike Gooding and one from Glasnant earlier on, and another, if I remember rightly. How can we get some more traction on debates which go on social media platforms, on TV, when it seems to us, as the red meat industry in Wales and other industries similarly, that we're often singled out as the bad people and the polluters in this debate. How and do you think that there is traction to be gained from turning that on its head to we are the solution, but also admit that we need to improve on the emission side? How do you, in your mind, think that can be generated and actioned?
So I think the majority of your society, and I haven't been to Wales, but I've been to other parts of the UK numerous times, and I know that the majority of your population does value animal source foods, such as eggs for breakfast, or bacon, and barbecues, and so on, dairy products. The vast majority of people do. There are some who don't, and they are very vocal, very vocal anti-animal agriculture people, very vocal, oftentimes supported by parts of the media. They oftentimes have the microphone, and they're extremely loud. And what people within animal agriculture do, they try to debunk what these extremists put out there. You know what? You can stop doing that right now, because you will never succeed to convince those extremists that almost have religious beliefs against what you do. Don't try to debunk them, but work with those people, the majority of your population, who appreciate your products, to assure them that what you do is providing the best stewardship you can for the land that you have custody over, that you have authority over, the animals that you are working on, that you care for the people you work with, that you care for the product you produce like nobody else. This is your legacy. Make it clear that this is your legacy, that this is not just a job for you, but this is who you are. You have inherited this gift from your parents, from your grandparents maybe, and you intend to hand it over to your kids. What is it that you want to hand over there? The best you can. Be authentic, be real, okay? Authenticity is everything. I am really sick and tired of people trying to fight with some extremists. I'm also sick and tired of many of the PR campaigns that look like we are doing everything wonderful and the world is great and we are the greatest solution to all the problems. You're not. You're producing food, you're doing it in a responsible way. Be authentic about who you are and what you do, and people will love you for it.
And just to pursue that, and I think it's a very, very important point, in terms of whilst the agreements are on a global basis to reduce emissions and improve the carbon situation, but surely the solutions are more localized on a country basis or even regional basis, and we need to have a context or a proper context, a wide global context on this, because I think there are places on Earth that where your food or where our sustainably produced food should be produced. And I think there's something for us to pursue in that respect. We're a temperate climate, we can produce grass most of the year, and we can produce on the back of that sustainable protein. I think that's a message, would you not say, that it should be furthered and levered with politicians and scientists the world over, because I think we've got to look at it in a holistic, global way.
Earlier this year I was in Ireland, and while there are differences between Ireland and Wales, they have some of the similar challenges. They're producing a lot of beef, let's say, and they're exporting a lot of that, like you do. And when you think of the inputs that you have, largely your feed inputs are forages, then you have a pretty extensive system there. And overall, I think your system is really good, and you are exporting a lot. If you were to stop doing that, let's say you would, some government would say, we want to cut your herd in half because then you produce less methane. I mean, it would be atrocious because it would be wrong. But it would also be counterproductive. And why would it be counterproductive? Because the demand for product would still be there. And somebody else in the world would attempt to compensate for that beef that now doesn't come from Wales. And that is called leakage, meaning while the production is leaving Wales, the demand is still there. Now somebody else will produce that who likely is less sustainable in producing it than you are. And overall, nobody is helped as a result, because a methane, a nitrous oxide, or CO2 molecule doesn't give a rat's where it's produced. These are greenhouse gases that matter, no matter where in the world they are produced. So let's produce food in those places that do it the best. That is my opinion. And I think most people would agree with me that the last thing we want is leakage to occur. And food production to leave places where it's going very well to other places where a lot of inputs have to be found all over the world in order to achieve similar results. It makes no sense. Wales is a great place to grow particularly ruminant meat and other ruminant products, and you should be celebrated for that.
On that positive note, which we, I guess, mostly agree on, all of us, I think I'm going to draw the session to a close, Frank. We've had a fabulous session. Thank you for sharing your A, knowledge, and B, insight to this very, very important issue. One which we must get right as a planet and as individual contributors in terms of country. And we have a responsibility not only to improve the carbon situation, but also to continue to feed the global population, which is going to grow. So very many thanks for your contribution. And we will no doubt have to rectify your Wales experience. And you must come here and because we do have a role to play in reducing our emissions. And the work that you've done with the California farms in terms of capturing methane, what do you do with it? How can you improve productivity by keeping the numbers stable? Are very, very important messages and if there are learnings that we can use and implement in Wales and the rest of Great Britain, I think that is crucially important for us. So I think that is a reason in itself, when we're out of COVID, to possibly take you up on that offer and to share with us your learnings and your expertise. So diolch yn fawr iawn, Frank, am helpu ni gyda'r sesiwn yma. Thank you very, very much indeed. I'm sure everybody, and I know from the comments that everybody is delighted with your contribution, which has been so balanced and informative. So I'm going to bring the, thank you, Frank. I'm going to bring the conference to a close for 2020. Can I thank you all for speakers, presenters, chairs, for all your input. It's been very, very good. And the participants, of course, who have fed through their questions and feedback and comments in a very constructive way. Diolch yn fawr I chi gyd. We need to capture your thoughts in terms of an evaluation of the sessions, which have been obviously various and numerous, and we will be sending you all an evaluation form in the next week or so to capture those thoughts whilst they are fresh in your mind. So please help us with that. And last but not least, you will see the presentations that you've seen or sometimes missed perhaps over the last 3 days on our media platforms, social media platforms over the next few days. So if you want to tune in again and relive, rehear, rethink, have a look over the next few days, and they will be on that. Diolch yn fawr iawn am ymuno ni. Thank you very much and have a nice evening. Diolch.